packet pushers.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Packet Protector, the podcast at the intersection of networking and security. I'm Jennifer Manella here with Drew Conry Murray, and today we have something exciting for you with a special guest. So, Drew, tell them about our guest.
Yeah, our guest is Stephen Orr. He's a distinguished solutions engineer at Cisco and also in the security working group lead for the Wi-Fi Alliance. And maybe you guessed from that title, we are going to be talking about Wi-Fi security.
Yep. So fun stuff here. The discussion with Stephen, we're going to dive into all of the different recent vulnerabilities that have been released, both from researchers and from some of the vendors like the Microsoft. We talk about blast radius, the SSID confusion attack. So you get his take on all of that and a little bit of how much on the scale of 1 to 10 we need to panic.
Yeah, let's get into it.
So since we have Steve here, let's jump into, first of all, the one piece of Wi-Fi news that everybody's been asking about recently, the SSID confusion attack that Matthew released a month or two ago.
Yeah, so researchers disclosed a vulnerability, calling it the SSID confusion attack. It's targeting a flaw in the 802.11 standard. Researchers are saying that all Wi-Fi clients and OSs are vulnerable. And essentially, the attacker spoofs a trusted SSID so that the user connecting to what it assumes is a trusted SSID. In fact, it's actually a man-in-the-middle attack.
These attacks are always interesting, right? I think you have to look at the details of really what the attack is, right? I think there's a couple caveats in there. One, obviously with any Wi-Fi attack, you have to be in a certain amount of range. I think one of the big tells on this one is also you have to have the same credentials on the SSID you're trying to move them to that's on the SSID you're trying to move them from. So I think one of the big things here from a security perspective is, there's stuff that we can do in .11 to try to boost up the security on SSIDs themselves. But just from a good practice is trying not to use the same pre-shared key or the same passphrase across multiple SSIDs at the same time is also a good thing. And if you think about it too, going deeper into what the attack was, FT was also not vulnerable. Like .1x is not necessarily vulnerable, but how .1x or a .1x setup enterprise network uses the SSID, the same issues aren't there when you're doing FT. So I'm a big fan of using FT. So again, being able to use fast transition, which calculates all your keys and other things in a different manner, gives us a little bit extra security with a lot more benefit than what we're doing today.
So the big picture of this attack is that you have to position yourself, because it's Wi-Fi, both physically and logically for a man-in-the-middle or an on-path attack. You spoof or set up a rogue network, basically, and then you repackage the packets that are going to the real infrastructure. But the weird little caveats and asterisks throughout this thing, the credential thing is one thing, because in my opinion, if there are two networks, now there's some other, I would say, assumptions that they make or assertions that they make that I think are just incorrect. I'm going to get to that in a second. I'm curious on what you think about that. But the fundamental idea that there's two different networks that, let's say the example they give is like a 2.4 and a 5 gigahertz version of the same network, but on different SSIDs. So whatever, network dash 2.4 and then just network. So they're two SSIDs, but the same passphrase or credentials. Getting in the middle there and forcing somebody into this other network, which is kind of the threat model that they're saying, oh, if you can make somebody think they're connecting to a 5 gigahertz network, but you actually are getting them on the 2.4. But if it's the shared credential, the 2.4 was intended for them to be using it too. So that aspect of it to me is a little bit just stupid, because you're doing all of this work to put yourself in the middle, to repackage these things, to push them off to a network that they already have credentials for. And it's just not that sexy or usable, because somebody could just do a very generic man in the middle attack, spoof the real SSID, and you're in the same boat with half as much work.
And I think what we have to look at is what's the actual end goal of any of the attacks, right? And I think we do tend to lose a little bit of that. Like, is the end goal to compromise the end device? Is it to monitor the traffic? What's the end goal for this attacker, right? And if I already have the credential, if I'm doing a man-in-the-middle attack and I already have the shared credential, one of the easy things would, as you said, I could just spin up another AP with the SSID and use the same shared credential to bring the traffic in. Now, if you look at the .1x side, right, where they did the same piece and they launched it from a .1x enterprise perspective, it also means that the rogue AP or the man-in-the-middle AP must have the same radius passphrase and be authenticated to the radius server so that the station, when it associates, it can already start doing the authentication. Otherwise, the station would jump off, right? Because the attacker at that point has already taken a trusted position in the network. It knows far more about the network than what you would anticipate, right?
Mm.
And what you were talking about before, JJ, is the two networks, similar names, but they're using the same credential. I see this a lot in residential, right? Residential, some of the SPs will set up, hey, this is my home 2.4, my home 5.
Mhm.
We'll have the same passphrase. They'll be connected to the same network. There's no isolation. There's no really preventative measures on there. It's just, hey, we're trying to get connectivity to the end users so they can just select one or the other and get on the network. Don't see that happen too much like in enterprise customers with IoT. It's more relegated into the consumer, home use space.
So do you feel like the risk profile here is then more like, sort of the coffee shop scenario where it's a targeted attack where I'm following somebody specifically to sniff what they're doing at the coffee shop, as opposed to I'm trying to attack an enterprise network?
Yes, it would depend in that case. Like in an enterprise network, the hope is that they've secured the infrastructure, that they're not allowing just rogue devices to be plugged into the infrastructure and have access to, the Radius server.
Yeah.
That's the hope.
There's hope, right? And we all know hope's not a strategy, but the thought process is there's a lot of other things that have to go wrong before these attacks bear any fruit, right? I know there's part of it, which is hey, if I switch to this 2.4 gigahertz network, it has a different SSID or it has the same one, that the VPN, like if I have an auto VPN set up based on trusted SSIDs, that the VPN will shut off, right?
Right. Yep.
There's, again, there's a couple things that, you're hoping that whoever's VPN client you're using, the wireless client, the network you're connected to, there's some feedback that you're getting. And it's one of the things that I get concerned about is from a station perspective, most people have auto join networks enabled on their iPhone, their phones, their laptops, what have you. So you're never really cognizant of the transition. And we also, from a vendor side, we don't let end users know what's typically going on in the network. Like, hey, you've just transitioned. Were you aware you just transitioned to this other network? Because it's usually connectivity first.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah, there's a few things in this paper, and I think research work is great. I mean, I think we need this. There's been a lot of really interesting things in the past coming out of this group. I think this one was just kind of a little bit of a reach, but some of the statements like that the 2.4 gigahertz band, so this is going back to trying to force people instead of to 5 over to 2.4, that it doesn't support things like management frame protection. Well, if you've configured your network for that, yes, it can. So they also kind of make assertions that typically or commonly the 2.4 network is served off of different infrastructure than the 5 gigahertz bands. And in enterprise, that's just not true. It's not to say that people aren't doing migrations or there's some little, interim stuff going on, but we don't usually have an overlay network of 2.4 with really old stuff. And then we bought new stuff and now that's running 5 in the same space. So some of it is like their assumptions about how this technology is used in the real world, like the use cases of it and how it's deployed are just kind of incorrect. In a second, I want to ask you about some of the recommendations they have. The other thing I noticed is that they did all of this using, MS Chat version 2. So they're basically doing username, password. Some of the language that they've used in here with the certificates makes me realize that it's very easy to accept or bypass the server certificate validation. But one of the things they didn't talk about in here at all was if you're doing this with, especially a WPA3 deployment, because they're saying WPA3 is only one vulnerable. But if you're doing this with 802.1x and the WPA3 deployment and you're starting to use certificates, it's much more strict and the user can't just willy-nilly accept crazy server certificates. So now you're talking about this other layer. And I don't know that that matters. I'm curious if that's another sort of mitigating factor here. They don't address that at all.
Well, so this goes back to let's say server certificates, right? So if you want to check server certificates, the presumption is that this man in the middle AP that is injecting or intercepting, right, it has the valid credentials, which means in theory, you have to have that valid connection to the same Radius server. So in theory, if it does have that connection, right, you've had some serious failures in your infrastructure that you want to be concerned about first. I would be more concerned there first, that I've got a bad actor plugging in devices into my physical infrastructure. There's far more worse things you can do there than redirect people to other SSIDs.
Yeah. In the section 4.3, it sounds almost like when it came to the server certificate, they did it with Edgerome. Now, Edgerome's its own little animal because that is something that is, a network and an authentication schema that's spread across universities and other hotspots around the world. So again, not a typical enterprise deployment. It's not set up the same way. It doesn't work the same way. But even with that, it looks like they had to look for SSIDs that use the same Radius server. And then they were able to push someone from one to the other. That's definitely a very limiting, execution of the attack.
Just to step back for a second, like you were bringing up PMF and some of the other things that may not be enabled on a wireless network. So there's a couple things there. I always look at from a consumer home use, my mom, right? Like, how's my mom's network configured, right? And this isn't a knock on consumer home use devices. She was having a wireless problem. Go figure who gets a call. So I go to my mom, and she got a new Wi-Fi router, brand new router. I'm like, because I'm a geek, right? I'm like, oh, let's go configure all this stuff that I've been working on. Why not? I was shocked how hard it was for me to find things like PMF to turn on management frame protection on this box. I think I was 4 levels deep inside a menu that had nothing to do with security
Hmm.
to actually try to find where to just turn on. Because, again, I wanted to find out because again, I'm a geek. I wanted to find out which devices, if I turned on WPA3 transition mode, which devices in my mom's house would suddenly not connect, and torture my mom and say, hey, look, we have to upgrade these devices, right? But it was difficult to actually be able to find. And the way I look at like residential is people are just taking their stuff, putting in new stuff and using the same things, using the same authentication mechanisms, using the same passphrases. And it does shock me that like TKIP in some cases are still enabled, which most home users don't know that you can't get anything better than 11N speeds, right? With TKIP still enabled because it's banned from being used that way. And people are wondering why their home Wi-Fi is slow.
Yeah. So I have two other little questions about this before we move on to the next one. I know we're spending a lot of time on this, but I think this is an important one. So it says, like, I'm on page 3 of the paper they released, where it's got the little table with the network type and whether it's affected or not. So it lists under home. Now, really, this is passphrase, not home. We use passphrase in the enterprise as well, but it lists WPA3 SAE loop and then CONST. It sounds in the description like this relates to the hunt and peck versus the hash to curve or hash to element implementations. Does that correlate to that?
Correct. Yeah. So, I mean,
Okay.
basically what that table is sharing is where the SSID is and is not used as part of the calculation of the crypto side of it. So in SAE hunting and pecking, which is SAE looping, again, vulnerable SAE, and constant CONST means constant time, which is what was done with the modifications that were done for hash to element.
Yep. All right. So we'll talk about that too, because I went down an interesting rabbit hole the other day accidentally. I ate the mushroom and fell down that hole. Drew, we might need to re-release a new table about what's actually affected in here. This isn't quite, in my mind, exactly translatable to what a network professional is going to be looking at. But all deployments that are using fast roaming, there's nothing to be done with networks if the SSID is being hidden from the broadcast, because what they're recommending happen with 802.11 is they're saying, hey, you need to change the standard operation so that the SSID is always, verified. So some of this made sense because it did sound like they were able to actually rename the SSID midstream and the endpoint kept going. Now, as somebody who configures wireless networks across a lot of different environments and vendors, they all reconnect when something weird happens. So that's interesting to me. But as far as just like validating the SSID name, I don't see what value that is on the first connection or even a subsequent connection. But when you connect, because in an enterprise organization, it's just a name that's being advertised and it could be from different APs, different vendors of APs within the same environment. And there's nothing that prevents an attacker from just spoofing the exact same SSID name. So I don't know if any of the mitigation suggestions they have for modifying the 802.11 standard really help. I mean, something might help this particular situation, but it's not going to help the other, 50 permutations of this.
Research papers are always good, right? In the sense where they help us find out where challenges, where vulnerabilities may be. But what we typically don't do is follow them up with, in a specific context, in a specific deployment type, how would we, or how should we, or how are networks being architected to be able to mitigate this? Or what's a best practice that we should be doing? So we tend to look at the individual vulnerabilities, try to narrowly focus on that and create a patch, as opposed to look kind of holistically. What are the best deployments, best methods to be able to use holistically to do this? So like matching, like doing VPNs, as they mentioned in here, trusted, untrusted VPNs. We've got to do a better job in informing the end user what's going on for connectivity. That's really what it comes down to.
I totally agree. So I'll wrap this up in a bow and say I think the TLDR on this one is, interesting research, some interesting finds in there. I don't think there's anything to really worry about because, frankly, there are quite literally 50 or 60 things that are much easier to do that gets you the same level of attack on an endpoint or a network than this does. So JJ's feeling here is don't worry about it. Interesting research, things to consider in the future, but I don't think this impacts anybody's deployment as it is right now.
Okay, so if you're hearing about the SSID confusion attack, don't panic. It sounds like is what you're saying.
Don't panic.
So please don't panic.
There's other things to panic about.
I'm going to jump a little bit, but kind of continue this conversation because we talked about that table on page 3 of that paper with the 2 different implementations of SAE. So this is a WPA3 network. So the latest generation of the security suite and Wi-Fi on a personal network where we're using passphrases, and SAE is that algorithm. And so Stephen was just, describing those 2 different implementations. So long story short, I got down this kind of side quest the other day, and poor Steven, I dragged him into it, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. But the TLDR here is that in 2019, with some of the same researchers here, we had the Dragon Blood attack. And, that was kind of like a big hoopla, at least in the wireless space. I'm sure Steven's got some stories about that. Maybe he can share some of them. But in 2019, there were a bunch of side channel attacks where basically data was being leaked because of the mechanism during that password derivation. And Stephen can correct my language here. And so they came up with the new version, which was that hash to curve, or I think Wi-Fi Alliance calls it hash to element, that didn't have, so that constant time constraint did not leak information. So my assumption was that all of the vendors, when they did their patching, because they all patched 4 years ago, that they all moved to implementing this WPA3 personal network using the hashed element mechanism or implementation of it. What I have since learned the other day during some little bit of fun playtime with Wi-Fi Explorer for a different project I was working on is they're actually mostly not doing that. So if it's in the 6 gigahertz spectrum, they are all doing the upgraded sort of H2E here, but it's kind of a mixed bag with different vendors depending on the firmware in the implementation. And is it 5 gigahertz? Is it 6? Is it transition mode? Is it not? So I think the takeaway here is I think we had something people in the industry and users of this technology thought were fixed from 4 years ago, and they're not. And, I'm kind of curious your take on this, Stephen, is did they not ever actually fix it? Did some of them kind of revert? I know at least one of them said they were seeing errors with certain clients, and so they set a default down to that hunt and pack, which was the Dragon Blood vulnerable version.
So let me just, before we get into the answer, if I can just kind of sum this up, we're talking about an implementation of WPA3. There was a Dragon Blood attack. Updates were made that were supposed to address the issues in the attack. But JJ, you're saying that Dragon Blood attack may be still effective.
Well, I'm saying the vendors didn't implement the fix, or if they
Okay.
did, they rolled it back down.
Okay. All right. But that's the context here. So, Stephen.
Let's unpack this one a little bit. So,
Yeah.
yes, the original launch of WPA3 Personal, to be very specific, right, it uses SAE. And the original SAE version is outlined in .11, used a method that was called hunting and pecking. And that was basically part of the password element generation. So the Dragon Blood attack came out, paper came out showing where some of the challenges might have been. And then we addressed it, right? And we addressed it in 2 separate ways, right? So there was an update to SAE that was driven through 802.11. We then adopted in the Wi-Fi Alliance for the security task group. And one of the first and foremost things we did is, once we came into the 6 gigahertz band, what we tried to do is remove some of the older, less secure protocols from the 6 gigahertz band, which that's a whole other discussion that we can get into that we've taken some heat for. But in 6 gigahertz, we said, hey, we're just going to use the newer security stuff. So with WPA3 Personal SAE, it's hash to element only, right? So we made very specific that we weren't going to carry something that was not patched forward, right? In 2, 4, and 5 gigahertz, unfortunately, you can't just kind of cut bait and not support stations that may have already shipped that supported the hunting and pecking piece. And this is always the Wi-Fi challenge, right? The Wi-Fi challenge is you have stations that are already out there. They've already shipped. They may not receive software updates. So what do we do with those stations? We can't just cut them off and strand them and, tell JJ you have to go buy a new garage door opener, right? Or your water heater, go buy a new water heater because the Wi-Fi might be vulnerable. So the mechanism we used is basically on an SSID. It's the same AKM. What we're just doing is signaling inside the beacon on which methods are available. So you can have both available, hash to element and hunting and pecking on the same SSID. It's up to the station to be able to choose it. Now, you can turn it off and say, hey, this is going to be hash to element only, but I haven't seen a lot of vendors have that very specific nerd knob to be able to turn off the older method. But in theory, they should be advertising both, and it's up to the station. The station should select the more secure one if both are offered. So it sounds like, JJ, what I'm hearing from you is what you've seen is that some APs are not offering the new hash to element capability, and you're still seeing some stations using the older hunting and pecking or looping method.
Yeah. And where I'm seeing this for the Wi-Fi nerds, and I did post a Twitter thread about this, is the regular RSN information is in information element 48 with the RSNE stuff. Then there's an extension of that. I think around it was like 244, where those are the extended capabilities. And then you'll see the bit set to 1 if the hashed element is supported. So what I'm seeing is I would expect that to still be offered to the clients, and I'm not seeing it offered in situations where I would expect it to, where we're in either WPA3 personal on a non-6 gigahertz, so 2.4 or 5, and in some cases so sometimes it's not there, and sometimes it's not there if that network is set for transition mode capability. Again, it depends on the vendor, it depends on, I'm sure, the firmware version, but this is something I'm kind of raising a little bit of a ruckus about, and I'm hoping they'll do something about it.
So what I can share is I know from the Wi-Fi Alliance perspective, I think it was 2020 forward, anything certified in starting in 2020 for WPA3 must support those mechanisms. I would say to double check, again, before we poke the vendor in the eye, let's make sure which version of software, one, that they are certified. Because again, the only thing that the Wi-Fi Alliance can do and industry can do is reference, certification organizations. If it's a vendor that doesn't go through certifications, your best effort, right? They could literally do anything they want and bring it to market. So that's one of the big things that the Wi-Fi Alliance brings to the table is it promotes that interoperability. You can at least say, hey, look, I know that these things are enabled, or my AP or my station is capable of these things.
So things for people to be looking for are in WPA3 passphrase. I want to make sure my client supports H2E hash to element, in addition to at least Hunt and Peck. Hunt and Peck, I guess, is the one that's vulnerable to the Dragon Blood attack.
Correct. And that's why if you look at the certifications, anything after 2020, again, which is when the 6 gigahertz really started becoming prolific, is when those certifications became mandatory in 2019, 2020.
Okay, so if I'm on 6 gigahertz, I should assume I'm default using HTE hash to element.
If you're on a 6 gigahertz AP, hash to element is the only thing available on 6 gigahertz. The AP should offer it in 2, 4, and 5 as well, unless it's been explicitly configured not to.
Okay.
So the takeaway, I think, for anybody that's configuring networks, if you're on the infrastructure side, some products will give you the option. So if you see the H2E option, I would highly recommend you select that. And if you were, just trying to see what's going on, if you pop open, something that lets you look at the different beacons, I mentioned Wi-Fi Explorer Pro, you can easily look through that, look at the RSN information elements, and then the extended capabilities to let you know whether that's being offered by the network or not.
So I understand I can get hash to element. It's sort of default on 6 gigahertz, but is there a client issue that some clients may not support hash to element, or is it strictly an AP issue?
In 6 gigahertz, there are no other alternatives for WPA3 personal. Again, depending upon when the client came out, if it supports SAE, if it's an older station, it may or may not, depending upon if it's received a software update. Again, it's vendor specific, right? So if, say you have a light switch that supports WPA3 SAE and you bought it in, when it first came out, it depends on whether that vendor has upgraded their stack to support it.
Okay, and you've updated that firmware.
Correct.
So let's talk about blast radius.
Yeah, this came out this July. Researchers released Blast Radius. This is a man-in-the-middle attack against Radius. It's relying on what the authors describe as a weakness in the Radius protocol itself. And I'll quote from the frequently asked questions on the paper. Our attack identifies a protocol vulnerability in the way Radius uses MD5 that allows the attacker to inject a malicious protocol attribute that produces a hash collision between the server-generated response authenticator and the attacker's desired forged response packet. So I think the big takeaways are here. We're talking MD5, we're talking hash collisions, and that's a problem.
Drew, my response is yes.
Great.
And I'm not trying to be flip about it. I mean, it's one of those things where, Radius still, unfortunately, regular Radius uses MD5. And it's why a lot of time and effort have been invested in doing RadSec. Like if you look at, Passpoint open roaming, there's a whole move to using RadSec to be able to secure the radius traffic between the authenticator and the authentication server. Again, in those cases, because it might be going over the open internet, I would share with anybody that's doing radius. If you can support RadSec, absolutely secure all your radius traffic, because again, it depends on where you believe your threat vector comes from. In this case, is it an insider threat?
Right.
Is an external threat on the internet? Again, it's kind of like building that fortress. Make sure you're turning on every available feature that you can in order to secure as much as you can, because you never know where the attack might come from. If you are able to break radius, you can do things like COA. You can, change VLANs. You can change other things once that device is authenticated, whether it's wired or wireless, right? This isn't specifically a wireless attack, right? It's on radius in general.
Yeah, and here's where I got confused. It seems like everybody's panicking everywhere across all of the different, messaging and chat groups and Slack workspaces about this and on Twitter and LinkedIn and everywhere. So I think, when I first saw this, I was kind of like, well, they have explicitly said in the summary implementations of EAP, Extensible Authentication Protocol, which is what we use in Wi Fi when we do 802.1x authentication. It's also what we would use with, a AAA config on a wired port if you're doing wired 1x. It's even what I use for, typical admin access logging in. So to say the EAP deployments of this are not at risk, and we can talk about why in a second, I'm kind of going, well, not that I don't care, but I don't think it's worth the widespread panic for the reasons people are panicking. I think there's a different panic we should have, which is a lot of radius deployments, at least in my experience, are people get it to the point that it's working and they don't half the time know why it's working, but they don't touch it once it's working. And I've seen this, a million times over. And, I think a lot of the radius servers I've seen over the years do kind of, Stephen and I were talking about, like they do pop up and just help you by selecting a bunch of default authentication mechanisms. And so in the radius server profile, you can tell it, are you allowing EAP? And if so, which EAP methods are you going to allow? And then things like PAP, CHAP, and MD5 are options outside of the EAP ecosystem that are different, but sometimes auto-magically enabled for you. And so from that perspective, it is a little scary because so much of the world's infrastructure uses radius. So how freaked out should we be?
So from an EAP perspective, I would encourage everybody not to use EAP MD5. I think that has been well said for quite a while. So again, if you think about how standards work, right? So EAP methods are used by Wi-Fi and by the Wi-Fi Alliance, but they're governed by the IETF, right? So the IETF is the one, they work on all the different EAP methods. What we can say is, hey, these are less secure, you shouldn't use these, or these are the preferred ones, right? So if you look at what we did around WPA3 Enterprise, or some of the things we've added into Enterprise, like server cert validation, TLS, we just went through an upgrade where we have TLS 1.3 that we're upgrading to for, all the EAP methods. So these are the things that we're trying to move forward, kind of in the look back, you've really got to know what you have. And we don't want everybody to be a cryptographer, but it's at some point where the responsibility may be on the vendors, it may be on industry to say, hey, look, these are some things you shouldn't use, and here's why. And I think, when I read through the blast radius document, I think even they pointed to the fact that, there's mitigations you can do to protect radius itself, management VLANs, other things, or move to radius with TLS or DTLS. And then, on the EAP MD5 side, there's a lot of other options that you can use out there that are more secure. You just need to pick the one that best fits your operational model.
Yeah. And so this particular attack was another man in the middle. So you had to be on that network where the radius is talking to whatever's trying to do the authentication through radius. And it was basically taking advantage of the MD5 hash collisions that we've known about for 20 plus 30 years to spoof an access accept message using MD5. So again, that's kind of where we are with this.
Yeah, you had to be on the network, and you also have to, during this radius conversation, be able to get that collision to work. There are some complicating factors, but the authors of the paper are saying, we did it, and it's not really that hard if you know what you're doing. So it is an issue. And I think another issue, JJ, sort of touching on what you said earlier, a lot of folks have radius set up, it's been set up, it's working, and have to start going into the guts and unclicking things and taking things off could be a little frightening.
And at the end of the day, if all this paper does is raise awareness on why we should be moving to the future for securing radius, that's phenomenal work unto itself on raising the conversation, starting the conversation to get network operators or administrators to go in and say, you know what, maybe I do need to look at my radius server and see how it's configured.
And how are radius servers being shipped, what default settings, and hopefully anything with NT5 is not default set. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So panic level then for this one, what's the vibe?
I think it's something everybody's known. It's just bringing it to light now that, especially in the world of critical infrastructure,
Mhm.
know what you have, right? It's really know what you have and take an assessment. So it also depends on your view of insider threats, where most of this, if you're doing radius across the internet, please put it in IPsec or please use RADSec of some type. Don't just send your radius traffic unencrypted over the internet to a centralized radius server.
Yeah. Well, and for that matter, radius shared secrets are sent in clear text if we're not in a tunneled or like a RADSec type of deployment. So typically within an environment, if you're talking about on-prem in most organizations, that exchange between whatever's doing the authentication and the radius server is sent in clear text. In addition to some of the other things like accept or reject messages sent in clear text. So there's already been a long list of vulnerabilities related to the radius authentication because nothing's been secured properly. So I think this is probably just one more. I do like that at least we can go, okay, at least like all of the Wi-Fi engineers or the network engineers who are doing with 802.1x deployments using EAP, this particular thing doesn't impact that particular policy or implementation. But I think it is a good time to go back and revisit and see what is configured, what's not configured. I don't know why RADSec hasn't been adopted before now. I don't know why it's taken us this long because we've already been saying for years, even in the absence of zero trust and leading up to it, a lot of our own networks can't necessarily be trusted. And we need to start to secure the communication between infrastructure devices, even if it's just sitting, 2 floors or 2 closets away. So the fact that we're sitting in 2024 still talking about why SNMP community strings and radius shared secrets, these things are all sent in a clear text.
To look at it slightly different, right? We all talk about zero trust architectures. Your single source of truth for authentication should start with zero trust, meaning there should be no communication that comes in or out of it that isn't secure.
Yeah.
If that's your single point of truth for identity and posture and policy, we need to make sure we're protecting that as well.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, if we have just a minute, I do want to talk about the recent Windows critical takeover Wi-Fi vulnerability from June. And Drew, I don't know if you want to fill everybody in on this one.
I believe we also talked about this in a recent Packet Protector episode, but in this June, a serious Windows vulnerability came to light. A vulnerable Wi-Fi driver allows remote code execution by an attacker. Again, they have to be on the same network in physical proximity to the client with the vulnerability, but it is widespread across, I think, essentially the entire Microsoft platform. So you do have to get that vulnerability patched.
Yeah, and I think we mentioned a couple episodes ago when we covered this in the news headlines that the weird part about this is it came out as like an 8.8 or a 9 something severity, and Microsoft released a patch. There's a CVE, but no other information
Yeah.
from Microsoft. It was just, oh, okay, yeah, there's a problem, we're patching it. So some of the researchers have reverse engineered the vulnerability based on seeing when the patch came out what was different in that code. And so we'll link to one of the Twitter threads again that has a little bit of that information in it. I've been still trying to dig up a little bit more here and I've come up pretty empty-handed. It has something to do with VLAN tagging. That's all I know.
So I've looked at it. Not a lot of details have been delivered on it. Again, I kind of fall back to the symptoms versus like what got us there. And again, what gets us there is how many people leave on their laptops, desktops, anything that's Wi-Fi connected, like auto joining networks. Or look, I'm paranoid. Anytime I leave my house, I typically turn my Wi-Fi off. Right. And I'm not saying that's the best policy for everybody, but I also don't want to spill out information, even if it's just what networks that I have at home that my devices might be looking for. Sometimes there's an error of caution that we want to take because I think that's part of what this vulnerability is. Your device is sitting there not necessarily connected to a Wi-Fi network, and it's vulnerable because it doesn't even have to join a network to have it happen. So the Wi-Fi part is active. So again, it's outside the realm of just technical. It's kind of the social engineering part of know what you have, don't necessarily broadcast all your stuff out to the world. And if you're not using it, turn it off. Right? If you're sitting somewhere and you're not connected, transmitting, turn your Wi-Fi connection off.
Yeah, I'm notoriously paranoid as well. And when I leave the house, and if I'm going to be traveling, like in large public areas and airports or on airplanes, or went to a concert earlier this week, and as soon as I leave my house, well, my VPN just stays on, but I also turn off Wi-Fi and I turn off Bluetooth, and that is how I travel. I don't know that that's the right answer for everybody, but I do think that one of the easy things we could do is to, start coaching people and configuring systems that we manage to not auto reconnect to, every Starbucks and every Hilton and Marriott.
Yeah.
But I think this is again, like, there's so many places in our systems where, as a user, it's hard to even have an informed user and do that education because the platform is not interacting with us. It's not telling us what's going on. It's like we're the little kid and it's, the operating system pats us on the head and says, "Don't worry, we've got this." And then they just auto connect your to every Wi-Fi network you've ever seen before without you knowing that you even did that. So, can we do better, Stephen, on notifying the users about what's happening?
I think we can. And I think it starts with the communities asking for it, right? If you leave it to vendors, we're all engineers, right? We just assume we know what's going on. But at the end of the day, this is all about the consumers, the end users. Again, not everybody's an RF engineer that's a .11 spec reader or is a security expert, right? Or a crypto expert. The more we can educate consumers and users, or even just the network operators as well, the more we can raise security, right? The more we can raise the awareness. And some of these things can be mitigated without a technical solution, right? Everybody was in panic until there's a patch rolled out. Well, maybe we can mitigate it some other ways before the patch gets rolled out, right? And even after it gets rolled out, there's still best practices we should get everybody to be able to utilize. So I think there's a bit of both. We've all run into this over the years. There's always going to be somebody, and the researchers do a great job of coming up with vulnerabilities. It's the practicality of the execution, right? Yeah, until there's more info released, though, I don't want to speculate too much on the how. It's just more of, hey, you have it, get it patched, and don't leave yourself in a vulnerable spot if you don't know what's going on in the network or you're not in a place that's home. Maybe turn your Wi-Fi off.
Yeah, I thought I was paranoid, but I realize I'm an amateur, so I've got another couple levels to go up. So, Stephen, one of your roles is in the security group at the Wi-Fi Alliance, and since we have you here, we thought maybe it would be good for folks who aren't familiar to just get some background on, the Wi-Fi Alliance, its role kind of in the Wi-Fi ecosystem, what it does, and what the security group does.
Yeah, I'll give you a 30,000-foot view. So one of the cool jobs I have at Cisco is I get to participate in standards organizations. So been in the Wi-Fi Alliance, God, it's got to be almost 15, I'm going on almost 15 years now.
Mhm.
And as the role, I was actually got the opportunity to be the chair of the security marketing and technical task group, where there's a bunch of amazing, really smart people from across multiple companies that we get to kind of take a look at what's out there today. We take information from the field and other things. And what we try to do is make sure we've got use cases that were being brought in from the community and then developing security, kind of solving the security problems of today while also looking for what's coming in the next few years. So like I'll share with you, we talk about WPA3 personal. So that journey that we were on to get WPA3 personal from the time that we knew that there were challenges with WPA2 personal, it was probably a 7-year journey for us to be able to kind of work through where we were, get the use cases, develop the technology, right? We do wait for 802.11 to develop some of the technology, and then we just bring them in. So really the role of the Wi-Fi Alliance is to test for interop and then utilize the tools that exist within 802.11. And then if there's something that doesn't exist, then innovate within there, be able to solve those use cases or solve those problems. So there's been a couple cases where there's been some innovation. Like you've seen things like Passpoint, right? Passpoint is a collection of capabilities within .11 to achieve an outcome, right? So while Passpoint, you've got OpenRoaming, you've got other things in there. So the role of security group is, so we have some of this forward-looking capability. We have a little bit of hindsight where if there's interoperability issues that get brought up, we've seen a lot of stuff around transition mode. We've seen a lot of stuff about legacy devices or devices that might not be certified that we have to take care of. Because again, Wi-Fi Alliance tries to promote connectivity as well as trying to be as secure as possible.
Mhm.
If there's a vulnerability that impacts Wi-Fi Alliance stuff, or even might be an 802.11, we also have, how do we react? How do we make sure we're testing the right way? How do we make sure we're addressing if it's something that we've integrated into the Wi-Fi Alliance to make sure that there's either a technical response, meaning there's a protocol change, or if it's just a deployment guide or education response that has to go out to the field. So it's actually a great group. It's been a long running group, and we're trying to come up and work on what's next, right? We try not to exactly time it with major Mac 5 releases like Wi-Fi 7, Wi-Fi 8, but there are intersections, like things with Wi-Fi 7 having multi-link, what impacts does that have on security? What things do we have to extend to make sure they're secure? So we do have a little bit of a forward lens on some of the things that we're working on as well.
And it's a multi-vendor organization?
Yeah, absolutely. Geez, I would say in security, probably at least 20 plus vendors that attend on a weekly basis.
Okay.
The entire Wi-Fi alliance is multi-vendor. And again, depending upon vendors' interest, there's multiple groups that are going on at the same time. So for security, we get 20 plus different vendors that'll show up to contribute. So I get the honor of working with at least 20 vendor peers on a weekly basis to drive consensus and move the ball forward.
So you guys do play nice together when it comes to stuff like this.
Yeah. What's nice, you have a bunch of type A personalities in a virtual no. But look, it's
Everybody's working for the greater good.
yeah, and that's why we try to solidify around like use cases, right? So, everybody's trying to solve use cases, whether every vendor talks to their customers or every vendor talks to, different industry outlets. And we try to bring things in and, consensus building doesn't necessarily mean 100% consensus. It means consensus within the group to drive things forward. So it's almost impossible to drive 100%. Everybody's on the same page at the same time, which sometimes is why it does take a little while to come up, not necessarily fixes, but longer term strategic stuff. It takes a little bit of time to bring everybody along and get everybody talking.
I think you'd probably be able to say the same thing about like the IEEE and the IETF, that consensus is a process.
Consensus is a process. The real difference between dot 11, and we have a lot of people that participate in both dot 11 and in the Wi-Fi Alliance. In dot 11, it's an individual membership, individual person, individual contributions. Wi-Fi Alliance, it's company based. So there's company representation and company voting.
Interesting.
There's a lot of cool things going on. That's why we like to talk with industry as well. So like without my Cisco hat on, with like a Wi-Fi Alliance hat, it's like, what trends are we seeing in industry that we need to be thinking about, not next year, but 2 or 3 years from now, so that we can start the process? Because not only do we have to kind of vet the use case, then we have to design the test cases for it. And the test cases are the really important things to promote the security, the interoperability, and also to make sure we're not breaking anything else, right? The last thing you want to do is use Wi-Fi 7 and security break something. It's not a happy spot if security's breaking something in a new Mac-Fi program.
So you are doing interoperability testing as well in the Alliance?
Yeah, absolutely. So originally the primary purpose, right, of the Wi-Fi Alliance is interop. And then a few years ago, when we pivoted with WPA3, one of the unsung things that we did with WPA3, we moved from just pure interop testing to also doing some conformance testing. So doing negative test cases, like, hey, maybe you shouldn't be doing this, and testing for bad acting capabilities. Moving forward, we're continuing to expand on, looking at things like, how do we fuzz, trying to make sure people aren't writing to the test. They're writing to the standard or the spec versus writing to the test cases. So they pass the test cases, but when they get a bit set in a specific way that they're supposed to ignore, that they don't blow up or bad things happen.
Interesting.
We're trying to modify and get the testing to be able to be a little bit more expansive. And I will share with you, from a security side, there's always a trade-off between security, connectivity, and length of the tests. Let me share with you that. Some of the tests, we've got to strike a good balance of what is secure enough versus making testing burdensome.
Yeah, when you said the goals were security and connectivity, I was like, ooh, that's a tough combo because sometimes they get in each other's way. Yeah.
And the thing is, we want to maximize the number of devices being tested, being certified, right? That way we know they work, they interoperate. But if the testing becomes too onerous, you'll get vendors that they'll just like, hey, I'm not going to go certify. I'm just going to go ship my product.
Yep.
And then that creates a whole slew of problems, maybe not necessarily in the enterprise, because it's potentially a different class of devices being bought in the enterprise. But then you get a bunch of home users that are going out buying devices that may or may not work with their brand new, Wi-Fi X home router, and it causes problems.
Well, this is probably a good spot to wrap up. Stephen, thank you so much. Now, we do have listener questions. So we're going to wrap up this segment from our Packet Pusher and Packet Protector Slack workspaces and some other workspaces. You guys spoke up. You wanted to do a little Q&A. So we have that coming up, and you guys can stay tuned for that. Otherwise, thanks for listening.